This first story takes us back to a summer afternoon in 1988. A seemingly innocent childhood altercation turns into a lifelong burden of guilt and fear. It is a dark, chilling confession. This is their story. I was just 10 years old when it happened, and the memory of that day has haunted me ever since. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, the look of confusion and pain that I caused. This is my confession. It was a hot summer afternoon in 1988, the kind of day where the air is thick with humidity, and the sun seems to hang lazily in the sky. Our neighborhood was bustling with kids running around, playing games, riding bikes, and just enjoying the freedom that summer brought. I remember the smell of freshly cut grass and the distant sound of an ice cream truck making its rounds. I lived in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other, and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. The park was the heart of our little community, a wide open space with a playground, a basketball court, and a field where we played soccer. That day, a group of us had gathered near the swings, our laughter echoing through the warm afternoon air. That's when I saw him. David was his name. He was a mentally handicapped child who lived a few houses down from mine. He was a sweet kid, always smiling, but sometimes he could be a bit overwhelming. That day, he had wandered over to join us at the park. I remember feeling a mix of annoyance and guilt. Annoyance because he was different and didn't understand our games, and guilt because deep down, I knew he just wanted to be included. At first, everything was fine. David sat on the grass watching us play, but then he got up and tried to join in our game of tag. He didn't understand the rules, and his clumsiness was ruining the flow of our game. I felt my irritation growing. Why couldn't he just stay on the sidelines? In a moment of frustration, I pushed David. It wasn't hard, just enough to get him out of the way. But I hadn't realized he was standing so close to the edge of the playground. He stumbled back, lost his footing, and fell. The sound of his head hitting the metal edge of the slide is something I will never forget. It was a sickening thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. David lay there, motionless, blood slowly pooling around his head. The other kids stared in shock, their eyes wide with fear. I wanted to help him, to do something, but my body wouldn't move. Panic surged through me, and before I knew it, I was running home, leaving David behind. The next day, the neighborhood was buzzing with the news. David had died from his injuries. The adults were talking about how tragic it was, how it was such a terrible accident. But I knew the truth. I had caused his death. I spent the rest of that summer in a haze of fear and guilt. Every time I saw his parents, my heart ached. They didn't know what had really happened, and I was too scared to tell anyone. Years passed, and I tried to move on with my life. But the memory of that day never left me. It haunted my dreams and crept into my thoughts when I least expected it. The guilt was a heavy burden that I carried with me everywhere. I knew I had to tell someone, anyone, to lift the weight off my shoulders. So, I turned to Reddit, hiding behind the anonymity of the internet. I poured my heart out, confessing everything. The response was overwhelming. Some people were sympathetic, others were harsh. But for the first time in my life, I felt a glimmer of relief. I had finally spoken my truth. As I typed out my confession, my hands trembled, and tears streamed down my face. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing years of pent-up guilt and sorrow. I described every detail, from the sweltering heat of that summer day to the look of confusion and pain on David's face as he fell. I wrote about the crushing weight of guilt that had followed me into adulthood, the nightmares that kept me awake at night, and the constant fear that someone would find out the truth. Even now, after all these years, I still think about David. I wonder what kind of person he would have grown up to be if I hadn't lost my temper that day. I wonder if his parents ever suspected that there was more to the story of their son's death. And I wonder if I will ever truly forgive myself. This is my confession. I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry. The story of David's accidental death serves as a haunting reminder of how a single moment of anger can have devastating consequences. The narrator's confession, though anonymous, reveals the deep and lasting impact of guilt and regret. It's a story that leaves us questioning how we deal with our own mistakes and the secrets we carry.
If you found this story as chilling as we did, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new creepy stories.
Our second story involves a series of eerie encounters with a mysterious man in a down coat. This Reddit user recounts a period of their life marked by confusion, fear, and unexplained occurrences that gradually escalated into a nightmare. This is their story. I never thought I'd share the story, but I need to get it off my chest. It all started when I moved into a new apartment complex. I was excited to start fresh, but soon, I realized I wasn't alone. I had just moved into a small, quiet apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The building was old but well-maintained, with a nostalgic charm that I found comforting. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, with a view of the courtyard below. It was the perfect place to start anew. The first few days were great. I spent my time unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting to know my neighbors. It was a peaceful neighborhood, and everyone seemed friendly enough. I enjoyed the solitude, the silence only broken by the occasional sound of distant traffic or a dog barking in the distance. It was on the 5th day that I first saw him. I was coming home late from work, tired and eager to get some rest. As I approached the entrance to the building, I noticed a man standing near the door. He was wearing a thick down coat, which struck me as odd considering it was early autumn and still quite warm. He had his back to me, and for a moment I thought he might be a neighbor, but something about him felt off. He didn't move or acknowledge my presence as I walked past him. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off as exhaustion and hurried inside. Over the next few weeks, I saw him several more times. He was always wearing that same down coat, always standing in different spots around the complex. Sometimes he'd be near the entrance, other times by the courtyard or the parking lot. He never approached me or spoke, just stood there, watching. Life continued as usual, but a sense of unease began to creep in. I'd be cooking dinner or watching TV, and I'd catch myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see him there. My friends and family told me I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, I came home to find my door slightly ajar. I knew I had locked it before leaving. My heart raced as I pushed it open, half expecting to find someone inside. But everything seemed normal. Nothing was missing or out of place. I convinced myself it was a mistake and double-checked the locks before going to bed. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. Soft, deliberate steps, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the rhythm of the footsteps. They stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't dare get up to check. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next day, I found a small, folded piece of paper slipped under my door. It had one word written on it. Soon, panic set in. Who was this man? What did he want from me? I decided to report the incidents to the building manager and the police, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. That night, I locked every window and door and went to bed early. But around midnight, I woke up to a cold draft in my room. I looked around, and to my horror, saw the man in the down coat standing at the foot of my bed. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, boring into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear. The man stood there for what felt like an eternity before turning and walking out of the room. As soon as he left, I jumped up and locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I packed up and moved out. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my deposit. I just needed to get away. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night haunts me to this day. Who was he? Why was he targeting me? I still don't have answers, and maybe I never will. I don't know if he was a ghost, a stalker, or just a figment of my imagination. But the fear he instilled in me was real. Every time I think about it, I feel that same cold dread. And I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting for his next victim. Our third story centers around a malevolent presence haunting a new home. Changing homes is intended to offer a new beginning. But for one Reddit user, it became the beginning of a terrifying ordeal. This is their story. My partner and I had just moved into an old house in a quiet neighborhood. We were excited to start this new chapter of our lives together. The house had charm, with its creaky wooden floors, vintage fixtures, and a large backyard. It was perfect, or so we thought. The first night was peaceful. We unpacked some boxes, cooked a simple dinner, and sat on the porch, enjoying the cool evening breeze. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustling of leaves and distant hoot of an owl. Felt serene, almost too perfect. It started with small things. The next morning, I woke up to find the kitchen door slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it hadn't latched properly. But then, other things started happening. One night, as we were watching TV, we heard footsteps upstairs. We looked at each other, confused. No one else was in the house. I went to check, but found nothing. Just empty rooms and silence. My partner laughed it off, saying the house was probably settling. But I felt a chill run down my spine. The disturbances became more frequent. We'd hear whispers at night, soft and unintelligible, as if someone was having a conversation just out of earshot. Objects would move on their own. Books falling off shelves, doors creaking open, lights flickering. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, I saw a shadow move across the hallway. I called out to my partner, but he was in the backyard. I stood there, frozen, knife in hand, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. It felt like the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely breathe. The first time we saw him, it was around midnight. We were in bed, trying to sleep despite the constant noises. I had just started to drift off when I felt a presence in the room. I opened my eyes and saw a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and his face was hidden in the shadows. I nudged my partner awake, and he saw him too. We both sat up, terrified, unable to move or speak. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching us. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly backed out of the room and disappeared into the hallway. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep. After that night, the activity intensified. We'd wake up to find scratches on the walls, furniture moved, and strange symbols drawn in dust on the floors. The atmosphere in the house grew heavy, oppressive. Felt like we were being watched all the time. We decided to invite some friends over for a weekend, hoping that the company would lighten the mood and maybe even provide some answers. Our friends arrived, and we spent the first night playing games, laughing, and trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that lingered in the air. That night, around 3 a.m., we were all woken up by a loud crash. We rushed to the living room to find the coffee table overturned and the front door wide open. One of our friends screamed, pointing towards the hallway. The figure was back, standing there watching us. This time he moved. He took slow, deliberate steps towards us. We backed away, huddled together, our hearts pounding. The air was thick with fear. My partner grabbed a broom and swung it at the figure, but it passed right through him. The figure stopped, turned, and vanished into the darkness. That was the last straw. We packed our bags and left that night, vowing never to return. We stayed with friends for a while, and eventually found a new place to live. The nightmares followed us for a long time, and we still feel uneasy when we talk about it. The house remains empty, a dark presence looming over it. Sometimes I wonder if someone else has moved in, if they're experiencing the same terror we did. I hope for their sake they haven't. I've read about hauntings and ghost stories before, but experiencing it firsthand is something entirely different. The fear is real, palpable, and it leaves a mark on you, a scar that never truly heals. This story leaves us with more questions than answers. What was the figure's purpose? Why did it haunt this particular house? The ambiguity only adds to the fear, making it a story that lingers in the back of our minds, reminding us that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are very real. Our final story centers around a mysterious disappearance. A Reddit user recounts the strange events leading up to their neighbor's sudden and unexplained vanishing. This is their story. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood has its perks. It's peaceful, safe, and you get to know your neighbors. But what happens when one of them disappears without a trace? I had lived in my house for about 5 years when Mr. Anderson moved in next door. He was an elderly man, probably in his late 60s, with a stooped posture and a kind smile. He kept to himself mostly, but we'd exchange pleasantries whenever we saw each other. Mr. Anderson's house was a quaint, single-story home with a well-kept garden. He spent a lot of time outside, tending to his flowers and trimming the hedges. It was comforting to have a neighbor like him, someone who took pride in their home and added to the charm of the neighborhood. One summer evening, I noticed that Mr. Anderson's mailbox was overflowing with letters and newspapers. It was unusual because he was meticulous about checking his mail daily. I shrugged it off, thinking he might be away on a short trip. But as the days passed, the pile grew larger, and his front yard started looking unkempt. Concern began to gnaw at me. I knocked on his door a few times, but there was no answer. I asked a few neighbors if they had seen him, but no one had. A week went by, and still no sign of Mr. Anderson. Anxiety set in. I decided to call the police to do a welfare check. The police arrived and knocked on his door. When there was no response, they decided to enter the house. I stood on my porch, watching with bated breath. They were inside for what felt like hours before finally coming out. They told me they found no signs of struggle, but the house was eerily empty. It was as if Mr. Anderson had just vanished. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I walked around the house, peering through windows. Everything looked normal. His furniture was in place, the kitchen was tidy, but there were no personal items lying around. It was as if he had taken all his belongings with him. The police concluded their investigation, labeling it a case of a missing person with no foul play suspected. A few days later, I noticed something odd. There was a faint light flickering in Mr. Anderson's basement. Curiosity got the better of me, and one evening, I decided to take a closer look. I walked around to the back of the house, where a small window provided a glimpse into the basement. Through the dirty glass, I saw shelves lined with strange objects. Jars filled with murky liquids, old photographs, and what looked like ancient books. The flickering light came from a single candle placed in the center of a table. I felt a chill run down my spine. What had Mr. Anderson been up to? I couldn't get the image out of my mind. The next day, I decided to go back with a flashlight. I managed to pry the basement window open and climbed inside. The air was musty and cold, and the silence was oppressive. As I explored the basement, I noticed a hidden door behind a large bookshelf. It was slightly ajar. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and stepped into a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in moss. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, and on it a collection of old photographs. I picked one up and my blood ran cold. It was a picture of Mr. Anderson, much younger, standing with a group of people in what looked like a ritual. As I examined the photographs, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The candle on the table flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt a presence in the room, something dark and menacing. Panic set in, and I hurried out of the basement, climbing back through the window and running home. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with questions. Who were the people in the photographs? What kind of rituals had Mr. Anderson been involved in? And most importantly, where had he gone? The next morning, I went back to the basement, but the hidden room was empty. It was as if someone had emptied the place. I reported my findings to the police, but they couldn't do much. Weeks turned into months, and Mr. Anderson remained missing. The house was eventually put up for sale, but I couldn't bring myself to go near it again. I still wonder what happened to Mr. Anderson. Was he part of some secret cult? Did he disappear willingly, or was he taken by something beyond our understanding? The mystery remains unsolved, and the house stands as a silent testament to the strange events that transpired. I've moved on with my life, but the memory of Mr. Anderson's disappearance lingers. Sometimes, I drive by the old neighborhood, and I can't help but feel a sense of dread. The house looks normal, but I know better. I know the darkness that lies within. Mr. Anderson's disappearance remains one of the great mysteries of the neighborhood. The hidden room and the eerie photographs all point to something far more sinister than a simple missing person case. Thank you for listening to these harrowing tales. If you found these stories as chilling as we did, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more disturbing stories from the darkest corners of the internet. Don't miss our latest video, Most Disturbing Things Discovered in Basements, where we uncover eerie and unsettling discoveries found in basements. These stories will make you think twice about what might be lurking below. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are true. See you in the next video.